Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. Joining us now is a guest we always love to have on the show. Lynn Parramore is a senior editor at Alternet, and she writes on the economy, various social issues, and other things that I guess cross your mind from time to time. Lynn, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here with you.
Well, great to have you. And listen, you wrote a couple interesting pieces lately that I wanted to talk to you about. The latest came out just in the last day or so, and it's about people being traumatized by life in America. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, my thinking on that topic was really sparked by a book that I read recently by a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk. The title of that book is The Body Keeps Score, and it's all about how trauma and traumatic events live with us in our brains and bodies. Now, the obvious case of that people think of are soldiers returning from war who have post-traumatic stress symptoms. They have flashbacks and things like that. But it turns out that many people in America are suffering from very similar symptoms. For example, a study came out a couple of years ago showing that people who were admitted to the hospital in inner city communities in Atlanta were showing the same rate of post-traumatic stress responses as soldiers returning from war. And, you know, these are people who are impacted, obviously, by economic hardship, by gun violence, by drugs in their community, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized when I started thinking about this that there are so many segments of our society, segments of the middle class, or what used to feel like the middle class, so many segments of people who are really suffering from trauma that not only lives in their bodies, but it gets passed down to their children. It's been shown that by researchers that the children of traumatized people can inherit the trauma, not only psychologically but physically. And I began to realize that the scope of this problem is really overwhelming. And even if we were to magically wave a magic wand and fix all of our broken policies, that trauma that's already been sort of written into the code of the minds and bodies of Americans is going to be with us for a very long time.
Well, you know, it's such an interesting point. We're talking with Lynn Parramore of Alternet about trauma in America. You know, first of all, this idea that people don't realize, people tend to, first of all, they have this kind of Manichaean worldview that mind and body are separate, and that, you know, if you have stress in your mind, it's a weakness that goes along with it. But neither are true. The mind and body are interconnected, which is a great point that you're making here. And the other is the notion that these can be handed down from generation to generation genetically, not through a change in the DNA, but through a change in the expression, the epigenetics, as they call it.
Yes.
So it's a multi-generational process of shift and change and harm that, instead of stigmatizing people for, we should be understanding and dealing with and coping with. So, and your point is well taken. You know, some activists, for example, I interviewed a monk from Thailand, a dissident monk but a lot of people talk about structural violence, and I think that's what you're talking about here. That
Yes.
there's the violence of being beaten and so on, and some of us have dealt with that growing up or whatever. But there's also the structural violence that comes from being hungry, from not having job opportunities, from being fearful from day to day how you're going to make ends meet or put food on the table. And that's a lot
That's
of
right.
what you're talking about, right, Lynn?
That's exactly right. One example that I mention in my article is the very distressing fact that there are 2.7 million children in America who have at least one parent behind bars. And that situation is so devastating for children that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention qualifies it as a traumatic event. And those children, researchers have found, not only develop behavioral symptoms and mental illnesses at a much higher rate than the general population of young people, but they have a host of physical problems. They have more asthma. They have more obesity. They have more diabetes. And all of these things end up making them more vulnerable to yet even more trauma, like sexual violence, like drug addiction. So I mentioned trauma as something that comes with a very high rate of interest. You might think of it as compounding interest. And so when we have policies that lock up vast numbers of people, often for nonviolent crimes, we haven't just punished and impacted them. We have passed on the trauma to their children.
Well, and then if we don't give the children the kind of support we need, we run the risk of creating permanent. I always, when I think about these things, and they take you to, and you gave me new ways to think about it, and I thank you for that, Lynn Parramore. But when I think about these things, I think about, for example, all sorts of things, including the different life expectancies of wealthy people, poor people, white versus African Americans and other minorities, and so on. But I also, when I think about it, multiple generations out into the future, sometimes I come to, the H.G. Wells book, The Time Machine, the Eloi and the Morlocks, where there were these beautiful, helpless people living serene lives in gardens, and then the vast majority struggling and suffering underground. And I mean, are we really creating the kind of society, a kind of society like that, that's where people actually suffer in their bodies and souls as a result of these ongoing and increasing class differences?
I think that we are, and the trauma gets expressed in different ways at different stages of life. One of the things that I mentioned in my article has to do with the number of adults over the age of 60 now who are presenting post-traumatic distress and stress responses, and that's about 15% right now. And when you consider the fact that the homelessness rate among the elderly is expected to leap 33% by 2020, you begin to see again this compounding interest. And so, people who start out disadvantaged as children, and in some cases don't start out disadvantaged as children, but things like the financial crisis have hit their families, and they have, been bumped out of the middle class. They really have a difficult time emerging. Our policies tend to amplify the harm that's already been experienced rather than alleviate it. I mean, that's really the sad truth. And so it's a very dystopian vision. And this was one of the most difficult articles for me to write, because I realized as a journalist and a writer covering these issues, I'm absorbing some of the trauma myself. I mean, I grew up in a middle-class background, but I don't have a pension. I don't have some of the things, the social safety net reassurances that perhaps my parents had when they were working at my age. Things have become precarious even for me. Much less people who have fewer resources than I do. And so, but I begin to feel like there is this collective experience of trauma right now that is really beginning to break us down. And there's not really any sugarcoating that I can put on that. My only relief in writing the article was to think that at least in talking about it and educating each other and sharing ideas about alternative ways of doing things, there's a connectivity that happens, which I think is one way to intervene and interrupt the cycle of trauma. But it's an enormous problem, and I don't have any easy answers.
And I think you touched on something very important in that last comment. We're talking with Lynn Parramore of Alternet about trauma in America. You touched on a lot of things. I mean, I very much identified with what you had to say for a couple reasons. One is, first of all, as a journalist who covers this kind of thing myself, I get a kind of secondhand trauma. I remember in 2010 when I first started writing about foreclosures, and so many people, I got letters from people who were suicidal saying, I thought it was just me. I thought I'd failed in life. I mean, it was deeply, certainly there was an element of trauma in my own experience of it, certainly deeply emotional. I am like you. I mean, I have no I had a little corporate life, so I was like, pension there or whatever, but basically not much. And, my mother is elderly and not well, and I visit her a lot, but she's in a home and comfort that, I can't expect under similar circumstances. Most of us can't. So that provides kind of, you wake up in the middle of the night, you're thinking about these things. But lastly, you got to a narrative of potential redemption here, and I want to talk to you about that a little bit, because you mentioned the book you read by the psychologist.
Yes.
Years ago, I read a book by a psychiatrist named Judith Herman. I don't know if you've run across it, called
Yes, yes. Mhm. I
Trauma
have.
and Recovery. And
Mhm.
and she says, Judith Herman was very clear that the way to work through trauma is exactly the way you described, in a sense, is to say collectively that people process their trauma and they heal from their trauma by helping others and coming
Yes.
together with others. So maybe before we go to a break and then afterwards we can switch to a new topic, but maybe just briefly, do you have any more thoughts about, not just for us as journalists, but people in general, this traumatized society, how we, a path toward healing?
Yes, I think the biggest danger that we face is numbing out and isolation. I mean, after the last election results came in,
Oh,
I just wanted to shut everything off. But gradually I began to talk to people and sort of bear witness to the feelings I was having. And that does at least form a sense of community, in a sense that you're not in it alone. And there are hundreds of responses to my article on Alternet and on Facebook where people did express relief just knowing that someone shared their feelings. And so I think this is so important for us to bear witness to each other's experience right now. I mean, we can't fix everything at the moment, but we can support each other as we go through what is really a collective experience of trauma in our political and social and economic systems right now.
it begins by bearing witness, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back. We're talking with Lynn Parramore, editor at Alternet. We will be right back after this with more from Lynn. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. We are talking with Lynn Parramore, associate editor at Alternet, about her recent pieces. First piece was on trauma, and when we went to break, we were saying that Lynn was saying that bearing witness and sharing our stories is important, and then of course, I think that's one of the reasons why the Occupy movement was so refreshing to so many people, because taking action. You know, once we've shared our
Absolutely.
stories, what are we going to do, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we might not be able to accomplish the task that we set for ourselves tomorrow, but we build collective ideas, we build collective visions of an alternative kind of society, really, and that will enable us to sort of go on. And I think the Occupy movement for me was such a breath of fresh air, just coming together and hearing people's stories. I'm in debt. I lost my home. What does that feel like? How did this happen? How did it affect you? And that kind of communication is essential.
And you know, it occurs to me, talking about trauma and talking about the healing power of actions like the Occupy movement with Lynn Parramore, it occurs to me, Lynn, that to mention the book by Rebecca Solnit that I believe was called A Paradise Built in Hell.
Mm.
You familiar with that book?
Yes, yes, and that's exactly it. We even during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages in Europe, there were communities of people. There were communities of thinkers and visionaries and scholars who preserved learning, who developed ideas, and were thoughtful with each other. And so maybe sometimes all we can do is preserve the values, preserve the visions, and make sure that they're carried forward. Make sure that we're teaching our children about them, so that when an opportunity arises, let's say an Occupy movement, etc., we're empowered to sort of step into that space and act. And so I think there's a light that gets passed between us even in the darkest times. And I mean, there's a real feeling right now that we're not entering, or perhaps in, the best period in American history. But it has always been the case that there are communities and pockets of people who carry the torch forward, and that gives me hope.
Well, that's beautifully said. And since you mentioned a light in the darkest times, that's a good segue to a slightly lighter topic that maybe we can close with, which is your piece on the 8-hour sleep myth and how I learned that
Yes.
everything I knew about sleep is wrong. And you don't sleep like a normal person, do you?
Well, the funny thing is, I always believed that I could not sleep like a normal person. I've been an insomniac all my life. I was always dead tired when I arrived at school as a child. I went to a school in high school that started at 7:50 in the morning, and I was completely zonked out. As an adult, I've tried, everything you can think of, from prescription sleep aids like Ambien,
Right.
to turning off electronic devices, etc. But one night, ironically, while I had
I'm
insomnia,
doing
I
that
came.
right now. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Lynn, but I'm a
Yeah,
terrible insomniac. I'm doing like the turning off the lights and all that stuff right
yeah.
now. That's why I laughed. Uh,
Well, the amazing thing that I learned one night while I was having, a robust bout of insomnia, I came across an article. Researchers had done a study where they put their subjects in darkness for 14 hours a day to see what kinds of natural sleep patterns emerge, and they found something astounding. They found that people tended to sleep for about 4 hours, then they woke up for an hour or two, and then went back to sleep for a second period. And this was a consistent finding. I thought that was remarkable because I've always been a person who woke up in the middle of the night, and it always stressed me out, and I think, my God, what's wrong with me? I have to go back to sleep. Well, there's a historian at Virginia Tech who wrote a book and had done research on, he went way back in history. He was looking at manuscripts from the ancient world. He looked at the Odyssey, and he found that there were multiple references to two periods of
mhm.
sleep that people naturally had, and they referred to the period in between often as something called the watch. And during that period,
Hmm.
people would do things like take in the animals or smoke a pipe or maybe have sex or visit with their neighbor. And this was the way people slept. And we have forgotten that that is actually the way that human beings are designed to pass the night. Now, all of this changed when things like electric street lights and electricity in the
Right.
home began to change the way we sleep. And there was an article in the New York Times several years ago that I came across, and the author had very cleverly referred to something called the sleep industrial complex. And he's referring to the fact that as the industrial age came about, it became advantageous to employers to sort of promote this idea that it's bad to stay in bed for too long, you're lazy, you need to get 8 straight hours of sleep and then be on for the rest of the day and the evening. And that really is not natural at all.
A message for insomniacs everywhere. Lynn Parramore from Alternet, as always, a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, very nice to talk with you today.
Thank you. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this. This is the Zero Hour.